Hi, everybody. This is going to be the last installment for me, for those that have joined online, as we have explored through Lent this book by Mike Graves, Jesus' Vision for Your One Wild and Precious Life. So I'm going to cover both chapter 7 and his conclusion. In doing so, I'm going to skip quite a bit of his personal anecdotes, and I hope that you have the book, as that really helps drive his points and his ideas home. But it extends my offering to you if I cover each of his little personal anecdotes and stories that help to illuminate what he is trying to impart to us as the teachings, the core teachings of Jesus. So let's start with chapter 7 first and foremost. And as always, this chapter is one of the 7 principal teachings that he lays out here. So this is the final one. And it's the title of the chapter is Love God and Neighbor, the most important word. Always he starts with a quote, this one from Anne Lamott. You can safely assume you've created God in your image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. Wow, that's a very pointed quote. Let me share that again. Anne Lamott, you can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people that you do. So his focus on this chapter is the last of his 7 essential sayings, and he admits at the forefront that he almost didn't include this one because of a couple of reasons. It doesn't come early, and it doesn't occupy the same place of importance that others have, as he has highlighted in prior chapters. Like there are 6 feeding miracles, and so he sees that as being like really essential, important. But this doesn't quite occupy the same place, nor is it early, and his focus has tried to be, rather than on the end of Jesus's life, the earlier, the beginning, or the core part of Jesus's life, his essentials, what his ministry, who he was all about being, and what he was all about doing. So reluctantly, he dragged his feet to include this one, and had considered even others in its place, but ultimately was convinced, as he was exploring the material here, that this was essential, particularly by the influence of students and other colleagues and friends. So the core of this, as might be understood from the title of the chapter, is what we typically call the greatest commandment. Now in Luke, which he already covered this in a prior chapter, it's connected in with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that question is, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus responds, what do the scriptures tell you? You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. And then he teaches about who your neighbor is by using the most deplorable of people to exemplify neighborly behavior, and that is the behavior that the Samaritan lays out. Now, in the prior chapter, he covered this as part of the parables, part of the way that Jesus taught about God's economy. And so it really wasn't about focusing on the greatest commandment itself. Here he returns to it, however, just in glancing past Luke's by saying, sort of covering, I've covered that in the prior chapter, but then looking at what other gospels promote. So first he takes a look at Mark's gospel to see how is it different, how is it the same. In Mark's gospel, it's a scribe that's having a discussion with Jesus, and the question here is, what is the first commandment? And again, the response is, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And it's a sense that you can't claim to love God and be bad at the other. If you love God, you also have to attempt to be good at the other. Loving God is demonstrated in your love of neighbor. That's what he sees as Mark trying to communicate. When we get to Matthew's version, it is not a discussion, it's a debate, it's adversarial, it's a test. It's even put that way. And a test was put before him there. Which is the greatest? Now the same answer is there. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which comes right out of Levitical law. And that is then attached with the little line, and a second is like it, which the translation could also be, and a second is of equal importance. And so similar to Mark, it's you can't claim to love God and then not also love neighbor. Now, sometimes we attach other things to this, loving our enemies in addition, but really it's contained within this sense of the greatest commandment: love God, love neighbor. Now, he admits that Christianity as a religion doesn't have the greatest track record of really showcasing the sense of living this greatest commandment out. And we can certainly easily reach back into more recent moments in Christian history and far back in Christian history and see that there were plenty of times that Christianity failed to see neighbor and instead created lines that separated people from really being part of those included in the neighborhood, if you will, based on gender, based on religion, based on ethnicity, based on race. So category after category after category, Christianity hasn't had the greatest track record. But he also, as an aside, because it's so easy for us to say, how can Christianity claim this? How can Jesus claim this? And then those who take on the name of Jesus claim this as their greatest commandment and be so darn awful at it. He showcases those examples throughout Christian history of those who have been exceptional at it. And I think it is important for us to hold those two things in balance as well as in tension. Yes, there have been plenty of moments that have not been great, have not showcased living this at all. But there has been plenty who have, plenty that has been done. Now, the problem that he sees, particularly connected with where it's all typically gone wrong versus when it's gone right, is that so often we get bogged down in the right way of thinking and not the right way of living or doing. So it becomes all about having our thought, having our minds in the right place, and not actually about our actions. And so we kind of mess up the formula in that regard, because really loving God is not a mental thing, and he lays this out saying that he doesn't know really what it looks like to love God. Yes, it's good to get together and worship and to sing praises and to pray and all those things, but it's not something that has an applicable, a formula that you achieve it by, whereas love of neighbor does. And so that's why this becomes the lived expression for love of God, that it's not good works for the sake of good works. This is how one expresses their love of God. And so where it's gone wrong and the times in which Christianity has gotten it so very wrong is because we've gotten bogged down into the right way of thinking that rather than the right way of living, of doing the right thing. And that's a very brief summary of this chapter. As always, I want to leave you with his 7 questions, give you a chance to pause the video and ponder these a little bit before I very briefly give an overview of the book in general as he does in the conclusion, which is what a conclusion is. And hopefully this has really encouraged you to think and to think critically about your faith and the application of your faith. So as always, he's got 7 questions, and I share them now with you. Are there any particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images that stand out to you from this chapter on the Great Commandments? How do these things speak to the way you hope to live your one wild and precious life? What about some wild and precious dreams related to loving others? Number 2, and the chapter begins with a quote from Anne Lamott about how we've probably created God in our own image if we think God hates the same people we do. Even if hate seems too strong, what does this quote say to you about how you view others? Number 3, if the Jewish faith counted over 600 laws and we now have thousands, how does this challenge your notion of laws within Judaism? Do you think of the commands in the Bible as burdensome or as gifts? Number 4, what concrete actions come to mind when you think about loving God with all your being? What does that sort of command mean to you? What do you make of the 2 commands being inseparable? Number 5, when you ponder the concentric circles of kin, neighbor, stranger, and enemy, what is your takeaway? Are these real categories for you? How do you decide where others belong within such a system? Number 6, what is the most important word in the Bible for you, and why so? And this relates back to a point that he made, that he had explored this, and ultimately the answer that someone he respected came up with was and it was the connecting word between love of God and neighbor. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So that was his most important word. And number 7 is the one he always concludes with. Is there an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting Jesus's focus on loving God and neighbor? Tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. Now the conclusion. What's next? Again begins with the quote. The fact that nothing lasts is the reason why everything matters. Now, in looking at this chapter, he ends where he begins. And that is to say explicitly that Jesus didn't come to die. That was not the point of Jesus's life. And we miss that when we focus so much, as typical Lenten studies have done, on that. Rather, Jesus came to live, and how he lived. And for how he lived, he was put to death. So I'm reading my notes as I'm doing this. And how he lived is ultimately what led to his death. So Jesus came to live, and how he lived ultimately is what led to his death, what led to him to put to death. And second, the life he lived can be a compelling vision for us on how to live before we die. So Jesus came to live. We want to live. How is it that we live with the days that we have before we die? He invites us to follow as we are. So we're going to go through the 7 key teachings. So the first one is that Jesus invites us to follow as we are, though to expect not to stay that way. So being called, the call of the disciples, number 1. Number 2, that we are to care for the poor and disadvantaged, to really do something. Number 3, that we're challenged to live more peacefully and gently in this world. And number 4, we are to feed, and we have that capacity. You give them something to eat. That we are to heal, that is to offer wholeness, not necessarily curing, but healing to others. Number 6, teachings that challenge the status quo. Jesus did this, which it particularly included the economy and acceptance. And so these are to be applied in our lives. And number 7, if we claim to love God, then it is to be shown in our love of neighbor. Those are the 7 key teachings that he lays out here. And this is how we unlock how to live in the days that we have before we die. So now is the time to live. One day we will die. That is a truth we will all face. But until then, it is about how we live in the days we have. And Jesus gives us a beautiful model for how we can live. We're called to repair the world, to make things right, to work for justice. We're called to enjoy the things of the world and to feast on the goodness of life as a foretaste for what is yet to come. So these are the 7 key lessons. What's next? To live our one wild and precious life. A very brief synopsis. I hope you did pick up the book so you got a lot of his personal anecdotes and stories, as they really do help to provide more to that. He does again conclude with questions. I guess I'll go ahead and give you those as well. Of the 7 sayings or teachings covered, which one's spoken most directly to you? Why do you think that is? What might it be saying to you going forward? When you read Diane Eck's quote about the opposite of life being birth, not death, what is your response? How would you like to live your life before you die? Number 3, given that life is a mixture of good gifts from God as well as present-day suffering, what does penultimate joy mean to you? Are you comfortable with flourishing in your own life, or does that seem inappropriate? What do you think about the less fortunate deserving to flourish? Number 4, paying attention to our lives is hard work, especially when daily life can be numbing. What sort of mindfulness do you practice? How might you incorporate more of that attention into your one wild and precious life? Number 5, when you think about family members or friends who have passed away, how does that speak to your desire to live well? Do you think of life as a gift, as holy? Number 6, are there particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images that stand out to you from the conclusion? How do these things speak to the way you hope to live your one wild and precious life? And as always, number 7, if there's an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting Christianity's focus on living life to the fullest now, tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. So thanks for joining me. I know the conversations will be continuing surrounding these in this coming week, I think it is, in both Thursday as well as AOL, before we return back to the this book, What's Next, which is great as we're coming into the time of General Conference of the United Methodist Church. So With that, thanks for those who have participated. I hope it's been nice to have a variety of ways to have a little bit of exposure to this material. This by far is the briefest of those options, but hopefully it's been a little something and helped you in this journey. And I pray it's been a place that has stretched your faith a little bit in the season of Lent. Take care.